The member from Toronto Danforth.
Speaker, thank you. To the Premier. Thanks to the Premier and her privatization of hydro, people's hydro bills are already sky high. Now we learn that the Premier plans to ram through legislation that will drive them even higher. Families are struggling, businesses are struggling. Why doesn't the Premier get that people can't take any more of her hydro hikes?
Thank you, Premier.
Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know I've talked about this in the past, but you know the criticism of the NDP's obsession with Hydro One doesn't just seem to revolve around that side, Mr. Speaker. Till Cawdas of the Globe and Mail calls the belief that ownership of utilities in Ontario affects rates one of the biggest misconceptions about electricity. Martin Reg Coes agrees that writing Hydro One can only charge what the OE deems reasonable, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, they don't get how rates work, Mr. Speaker. The Ontario Energy Board will set the rates, not Hydro One. When we're looking at a plan that is reducing rates by 25%, Mr. Speaker, the only thing that they had when talking about a 5% reduction, Mr. Speaker, was a conversation with the federal government. Well, I believe, Mr. Speaker, they're sending the member from Bramalea Gore-Malton to actually have that conversation there tonight. Maybe he can start having that and add something to their plan.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Thank you, Speaker. And again to the Premier. What the minister was talking about, this borrowing scheme is a $40 billion plan to avoid the Liberals losing the next election. That's why that $40 billion is being spent. It will make life harder for families and businesses who are suffering under already sky-high hydro rates. Is the Premier so desperate to win that she plans to pass this bill at the last minute, knowing that it will end up costing Ontarians more on their hydro bills?
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I know the honourable member is talking about our plan and the costs that are projected out in 2027. Well, that means that we'll be in government by then, Mr. Speaker, for 24 years, making sure that we can continue to find ways to pull costs out of the system. We've done that over and over again, Mr. Speaker, on a consistent basis. We have found ways to pull out $3.5 billion by renegotiating the Samsung agreement, taking $1 billion out of the FIT price contract, Mr. Speaker. We also suspended the LRP2 contract, which also reduced billions of dollars from the system, Mr. Speaker. So when looking at what we're doing as a government, we continue to find ways to reduce costs out of the system. And if passed, Mr. Speaker, a 25% reduction coming for all families, small businesses and farms in this province, Mr. Speaker, once we can get this legislation passed through this House, Mr. Speaker.
New question.